This is Keith Helwig from Cops Corrections Videos. The last video I did, I talked about cops that all cops know. What I'd like to talk about in this video is supervisors that all cops know. Now once again, when I use the term cops, I'm using it as a generic term for all in law enforcement, including correctional officers, probation parole officers, police officers, sheriff's deputies, etc. So, into the topic. Supervisors, we all know. When I started out my career, I worked with some old-time supervisors who were World War II vets, and they acted like they were still in the Marines and you should be a Marine. Things have changed. That was 40-some years ago, and things have changed over the course of time. When I started, it was pretty much a given that you had to have 3 years to be a sergeant, 5 years for a lieutenant, 7 years for a captain. Now, one of the supervisors we all know today is the guy who goes to school and gets a degree in criminal justice. Now, he comes out of that, he gets a job, he goes to the academy, he gets out of the academy, and just about the day he's out of the academy, he starts taking promotional exams. He does great on them. The reason he does great on them is he just got out of school, he's used to taking tests, he's used to studying, and let's face it, he hasn't been beaten down much by the job yet. So they do great on the tests. Now, as I said, when I started, there was a 3-5-7 unwritten rule. I had probably 4 years in. I was 26 years old. I'd been to school in criminal justice. I decided I was going to take the test to see if I could pass the lieutenant's test. Well, I passed it, and I eventually ended up getting an interview at a maximum security institution. Now, I never worked in a maximum security institution, and I didn't really expect to get the position. I did it more or less just to see what the interview process was. However, a couple days after I had the interview, my security director called me in and said, "You know, Keith, they really liked you. They think that someday you're going to make a good supervisor, but they just feel you don't have the experience." I understood that. I understood it, and I took it for what it was worth. I didn't have the experience. You know, one of the things that young supervisors tend to forget, they'll promote, they'll have 3 or 4 years in, and they don't seem to realize that they really haven't earned respect. In law enforcement, as with most professions, if you want to be respected, you have to earn respect. You have to do that through your knowledge, your training, and your experience. You have to show people you're worthy of their respect. Now, we all know supervisors who rule through fear and intimidation. I've had supervisors like that in the past. I've worked with supervisors like that. They expect that their staff is going to respect them because their staff is afraid of them. Well, there's a big difference between fear and respect. If you fear a person, you're going to do what they say, and you're going to resent it every time they tell you to do something. If you respect that person, they can tell you to do the same thing, and out of respect, you're going to do it, and you're going to do a good job of it. Now, I've had supervisors who have ruled simply by fear. I see supervisors now that I know are still working, and they rule by fear. They rule by intimidation. I can recall another supervisor that I had when I first started. I'm going to call this individual Floyd. Floyd was of Southern descent and spoke with a very distinct accent. Floyd was the type of lieutenant, if you had a problem with someone and you needed them locked up, Floyd would come down to the unit to lock them up, and he would walk straight over to that inmate without even talking to you as an officer, and the first thing he would say to that inmate is, "What did that sergeant do to piss you off?" Well, you can imagine how that made the staff feel. That was totally demoralizing. It undermined their authority. It undermined their credibility. Now, on the other hand, Floyd had a captain. And I'm going to use the captain's real name. His name was Marty. Marty was a big guy. Marty's a friend of mine. He was a friend of mine then. He's still a friend of mine now. Marty knew that when myself or other officers called him to have somebody locked up, put in a temporary lockup or segregation, that they deserved it. Marty would come into the unit and he would approach the officer and say, "Okay, what did inmate Smith do?" And you'd say, "Well, he was disruptive." Okay, that's all you had to say. He would go over to inmate Smith and we would place him in handcuffs and take him out. Now, Marty would talk to the inmate about what happened, but he did it afterwards. Officers respected him, not because he would lock them up at inmates up at a moment's notice, but because he respected the officers enough to know that they knew what they were doing as well. You know, a quick story about Marty. He and I, when we were on the emergency response unit, responded to a riot at another institution. And at one point during this disturbance, we were trapped in a hallway, which was secured by crash gates on both ends. There was myself, there was Marty, I think there was 9 or 10 other officers, and about 70 inmates. The thing I recall vividly is Marty and I standing back to back with our shoulders against the wall. I knew he had my back, he knew I had his back. I respected him, and he in turn respected me. Now, when I promoted to lieutenant and eventually to captain, I can't say that I'm the world's know-all, do-all, best captain in the world. Everybody loved me. There were people that didn't, and rightly so. There were people that didn't. You know, I did my job. I did what I was supposed to do. However, unlike some supervisors, the last security director I worked for had an expectation that any time a staff member did something wrong, you put it on paper. I didn't operate that way. I never operated that way. If I thought a staff member was doing something wrong, I would confront them about it. And I'd tell them right out. If it was something on hearsay or another staff member told me about it or whatever, I'd call them in and I'd say, listen, I'm not saying you're doing this. I'm not saying you're not doing it. If you are doing it, knock that crap off. If you're not doing it, nothing to worry about. Well, if they did it again, then there was something to worry about. Then they'd get written up. Now, contrast that with a man that I know as a captain now. He wrote an officer up when the officer was leaving the institution because the officer stopped in the library to use a state paper cutter, and he wrote him up for unauthorized use of state property. Well, needless to say, the whole thing was laughed out. Now, can you imagine how much officers respect this captain? He's still a captain. He was a bobblehead. He was one of the chosen one of the security director. He was a yes man. And that's how some people get promoted. We all know the people that get promoted that don't deserve the promotion. They get promoted on who they know rather than what they know. A lot of people wait to take the jump into being a supervisor. I worked as a line officer for 17 years before I did that. After I had almost 25 years in, I left corrections, worked at the sheriff's department. I retired from there as a lieutenant. I got bored and I went back to work as a captain for a few more years for the Department of Corrections. During that entire period of time, I was also working as a police officer. And when I finally left the Department of Corrections for good, I continued to work as a police officer, obviously. Supervisors, we all know. We all know good supervisors. We all know bad supervisors. You can learn from the bad supervisors just as much as you can learn from the good supervisors. You can learn what not to do. You can learn how not to treat staff. The same way, you can learn from a good supervisor how to gain respect, how to earn respect, how to do your job. The thing as a supervisor that every supervisor needs to remember, whether you're in a position where a sergeant's a supervisor, a lieutenant, a captain, you need to remember first and foremost, you are an officer. When I was a lieutenant, I was a supervising officer 1, supervising officer. I was an officer among everything else. When I was a captain, I was a supervising officer 2, officer. You need to remember that. First and foremost, you're an officer. When I was a lieutenant for the sheriff's department, I was a deputy. I was a lieutenant, but I was a deputy. That was my primary purpose, was to be a deputy as well as being a supervisor and doing what's required as being a supervisor. You know, just because you wear 3 stripes on your sleeves or a gold bar on your collar or 2 gold bars on your collar, it doesn't make you any better than any of the other officers that work for you. We're all in this business together. We all do the same thing. As a lieutenant or a captain, if you are hesitant to do something, don't expect your staff to do it. I know as a captain, I never expected my staff to do anything I wouldn't do, whether it was patting down inmates, searching cells, doing strip searches. And Same thing when I was a lieutenant for the sheriff's department. There wasn't anything I expected the deputies that worked under me to do that I myself wouldn't do. Once again, as I stated in my last video, we all need to work together. We can all learn from each other. So once again, it doesn't matter if you have 3 stripes, 1 gold bar, 2 gold bars, an oak leaf cluster, or 5 stars on your collar. Remember where you were, remember where you came from, and remember you are an officer, a deputy, before anything else. Until next time, this is Keith Heller from Cops Corrections. Stay safe and watch your back.